everyone, and we are here with Dr. Grace Lee. Hey, Dr. Lee, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on your show.
Yes, it's awesome to hear and to see you. And if you can start a little bit and telling us about your background, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So, doctor, because I have a PhD in neuroscience, and neuroscience was always an interest in mine. For actually, it started out for bad reasons. I had a near spinal cord injury, and I nearly ended up as a quadriplegic. So that experience was a long recovery. It was really painful. It changed my life, and it really got me to realize that there's so little that we know about the central nervous system. And so I wanted to do something about it. And I contemplated going for a medical doctor. And then I decided, no, I want to get to the root cause of the problem. I want to come up with the treatments, the solutions. And that's how I decided to go the PhD route. And I chose neuroscience. And my first background was in spinal cord restitution, researching spinal cord. And then I graduated from that. I moved into brain disease, brain trauma, brain and health and disease. And that's like 12 years designing experiments to understand the brain, did my publications and all that. And then I decided to leave the academic pillars, decided to leave academia. It didn't align with my values. So I decided to go into the corporate world. So here I was in the corporate world, 2 years into that, and I decided again this did not match my values. I didn't enjoy the political and the bureaucracy and politics and in the corporate world. So I left the corporate world, and that's where I started my business, and that's what I'm doing today, my coaching business.
Wow, that's awesome. There is so much there, right? And then in when you were doing your spine studies, what type of research were you specifically focusing on at that point?
Yeah, it was looking at, for example, when you have a spinal cord injury, an actual injury where there's paraplegia or quadriplegia, the spinal cord itself forms scar tissue. So my research question was, well, how can you reduce the scar tissue to bring back some more functionality after a spinal cord injury? Yeah, that was my research topic.
Oh, that's great. And what sort of insights did you gain? I'm sure so many, but what are some of the insights that you gained from doing the research, or from the research itself, or from the results themselves?
Yeah. So one of the findings that we had, and again, this is really outdated because it was more than a decade ago, but my finding at the time was that at the scar tissue, there's a cascade of events that happen at a cellular level. And when we understand this cascade and we can see why neurons are dying, why cells are dying, which causes us to lose our movement or our sensation, there's ways that we can intervene in the process to, one, to prevent it from getting worse, and second, to bring out external help into that area to restore some functionality. And this is really the direction that the whole field has gone. And we've seen that there has been some success in terms of patients gaining functionality, gaining some movement and sensation back into their limbs after a spinal cord injury.
Hmm, that's really cool. And what sort of things did you notice that were doing, one, interrupting the cascade going down, or two, recruiting more of the body's resources, I guess, to be able to start repairing or stopping the scar formation?
Yeah. So in terms of adding external help, it wasn't external help from the body itself. It was through generating other tissues and cells to implant or surgically implant into that site. And of course, I want to say for your listeners that we weren't doing these on people.
Right.
We were, of course, this was basic research, so we were doing them on models, like animal models in the lab. Yeah, because this was very preliminary research, and it was like 10 years ago. So this was an idea that a group of research group had designed, and we wanted to explore the possibility of that and bringing that into medical care.
Oh, that's great. And then, personally, what sort of insights after all these years in the research did you walk away with?
On a personal level, it was very inspiring because I came close. I didn't have a spinal cord injury. I'm not paralyzed. And eventually, I did regain all of my sensation. But I had such a close call that I resonate with those who were less fortunate. Right. So for me, I was very inspired by this field and a lot of funding that goes into that type of research. And I'm very optimistic about the future too. Lots has happened since I was a researcher in that field. So much has happened. And I do stay afloat of some of the progress. So I'm very optimistic about the future. Although it's overly optimistic at this point where someone can go from being a quadriplegic or being in a wheelchair all of a sudden to be leaping out and playing basketball again and jumping hoops again. That is still a bit too optimistic right now. But there's still a lot of functionality that patients can regain that was never once thought possible before.
Yeah, I did. That's interesting that I didn't know that background, and it's amazing to hear a lot of the background. And yeah, I did some spinal rehabilitation in a Gaylord, is a spine rehab center in Connecticut, and I was amazed to see how much resiliency and how much the patients. I mean, couple of cases, we had young people who were professional athletes and physicians, and how much overnight they just lost everything from here down, and some of them would become interested per se in the process of gaining their strength, learning a new way of life. Like, how can I get back even if I don't have any legs right now? How I'm going to get back and do competitions. And so it's amazing to see that mindset where there is not even they heal so fast and then they start just moving forward, different functionality. And how has that kind of impacted you? How much the mindset has to do with it? um,
Oh my gosh. So what happened, and I love that question because it's a great segue. What happened was after doing spinal cord research, I then moved up to the brain. So my PhD then focused on brain injury, brain neurodegenerative disorders. And these are movement disorders, motor neuron diseases, which is not related to spinal cord injury, but it's a disease that affects our movement. And what we find is that your brain is very, very, very capable of a lot of adjusting itself, of plasticity, neuroplasticity. It's very capable. And so we have a lot of myths about what our bodies can and cannot do. When we come into disease, we're facing a disease or we face an injury where we lose a certain capacity. Our bodies are capable of more than making up for that in other areas. So if even if we have a spinal cord injury and everything below that is not functioning, the thing is there's a lot of adjustments happening on a molecular level in the central nervous system. Although our bodies cannot repair that spinal cord back to its previous injured state, our brains can mold and adapt to that functionality. You must have heard of people who are suddenly they lose their eyesight, and then all of a sudden their listening is more acute, and their ability to feel things and sense things are more acute than they ever were before. So that's adaptation. And there's more and more evidence of that adaptation. And when you're attuned to it, when you take the intent to develop that more with voluntary actions, with a game plan, with a strategy, you can live a very high quality life.
Yeah, I completely agree. So much. One of the guys that comes into mind was he was a professional athlete and he had a tragic accident and lost both limbs, and it was so crazy because he adapted so fast to this change. He like it's almost like from the Navy SEALs when they say like when they something really bad happens and they say reorient yourself to the new reality. And he was like so fast, almost to the concerning to the team because we thought that he wasn't really like he wasn't healing, like he was just kind of brushing it off what happened, but really he was almost so amazing. And then you're so right that he adapted so fast that he was in his mind he was already like in a special Olympics. He was like in his mind he was doing wheelchair races in his mind, and he did so fast, and a couple of years later he had a book and then he was speaking in stages. And so it's so amazing how adaptation has to do with this. And so then from all your work at that point, what do you think that what is kind of intentionally, what is a great way when you're moving up to the brain now as your PhD, what was kind of some of the ways or some of the research that were you doing in adaptation that we could do that intentionally?
Right. So my PhD focus wasn't, it was still preclinical. So in other words, I didn't work with patients until my postdoctoral fellowship. But by
Got
the
you.
time, yeah, so in my PhD, I was still working with animal models, but this time it was an animal model of disease. Specifically, it was ALS. I
Oh,
focused on
that's
ALS.
tough.
Yeah, it was on ALS and also a little bit about a little on Parkinson's and Alzheimer's as well. So all the neurodegenerative spectrum of disorders. That was my PhD. So there was I didn't work with patients or other practitioners, right? Until I did a postdoctoral fellowship, and I switched my focus completely. So this was my clinical, my taste of clinical is it my foray into the clinical world happened in my postdoc, where I started to work with patients and other practitioners who worked with patients, and we were trying to improve the landscape of healthcare for patients with brain trauma. And one of the
Mm.
things that I did when I was interviewing a lot of patients, families of patients, family members of patients, I was interviewing a lot of practitioners who have had years working with patients. And one of the themes that I noticed is that our intent is very important. So, first of all, it's about having a mindset, a belief that I can have a quality of life. I can be happy. I can have all the things that I want to do. I can still do everything I want to do in life, despite having, ALS or brain trauma, right? Of course, I'm talking about people who still have, who are not in a coma or vegetative states. That's what I'm talking about. Because severe brain trauma, some people end up there and
Right.
they're in vegetative states. But even then, there have been discoveries of some patients with vegetative states. They're not able to speak because they're in comas, but there's a certain level of a coma where they have enough awareness that through functional MRI they still have self-awareness and they can answer questions, simple yes or no questions in the functional MRI. So that shows how dynamic our brains really are,
Hmm.
and that our it's it I don't want to use the aphorism, the cliche of mind over matter. I don't want to
Right.
use that cliche because that's really not what I'm getting at. But what I am saying is that what you believe to be true in your life can become true if you combine that with action, right? And this goes with a lot of the work that I do in career coaching. Executive coaching is the same way, because our perceptions of the world, they shape our realities 100%, right? And so the science says that too.
Yeah, what's that book? Isn't there a book written by somebody who had locked-in syndrome, written with their eyelash, with their just the blink of an eye? What's? I actually haven't read that book.
I
How?
I haven't either, but that is a case study that gets passed around a lot. But that one is just a misunderstanding of the disease, right? It's a misunderstanding that ALS affects our cognition, but it doesn't, right? ALS doesn't affect the cognition. It's when there's ALS combined with dementia and Alzheimer's, right? Then that's when the cognition gets affected. But purely on a purely ALS spectra, if the disease is just ALS and it's just a motor neuron disease, it's a movement disorder, then that is proof. That case study shows that a patient's cognition is largely, if not at all, affected. So, it
Wow.
shows that there's segregation in the brain, right? There's segregation. There's parts of it that are involved. It's a whole network. There's parts of it that are involved in speech, right? So if you have ALS, you may not be able to speak if it's affecting you, the nerves that are innervating your face, right? And then but you still can hear, you still can see, because those parts of the brain, those networks are not affected. So you see, there's segregation in the brain, but the beauty of it is they all work together. And if one of them malfunctions, the other one has the propensity to get even better. And that's the fascinating thing about it.
Yeah, it is. It is fascinating. And then when what was one of the and so then from the brain research that you did, or from the what was kind of the some of the is there a story that you remember of some sort of implementation or um, something that you did as a team to improve the lives of these patients or the clinical delivery of these patients with movement disorders? Is there anything that comes to mind as one of the stories that you had with that?
Yeah, there was a story of a patient, and I can't reveal any names,
R-
right? So there's a
Right.
story of a patient who had a severe brain trauma with a car accident, and he immediately was in a coma, and he was extracted from the vehicle. He was in a coma, and for many, many months, he was in a coma. And this months turned into years. He was in a coma, but the family members stayed optimistic. The family members did not want to withdraw treatment. So he was in the hospital in a coma for over a year, and it turned into a couple years already. And then
Wow.
the science, right? And then the science developed. The science of understanding consciousness developed. And there's one particular researcher. His name is Adrian Owen, and he's based in London, Ontario, in Canada. He was my former colleague, right? He put the patient in a MRI scanner and saw brain activity that wasn't, it was not abnormal, it was not, it was, there was brain activity. And so he had this notion to start to talk to the patient and sort of like ask simple questions like yes or no questions. And of course, the patient can't speak yes or no. So he would be like, if the answer is yes, then I want you to think about this. If the answer is no, then I want you to think about performing this task, like pretend that you're playing the piano. So when you imagine that you're playing the piano, your motor cortex lights up, you know, because you're imagining your fingers moving playing the piano. But if I ask you to think about a different task that is not a motor task, it's like smelling a rose, then different cognitive area will light up, you know, you see the experiment. And
Yeah.
so the patient got it right every single time.
Wow.
He answered it
That's
yes. So that was the first, so this was during when I was a postdoc. That research was just starting to come into light, and of course this was a huge controversy. And there
right.
was, yeah, huge
As you're talking, I'm thinking of all the controversies because I work in the hospital every day, and so all that controversy, there's a lot there. Yeah.
huge controversy. And it also started a huge conversation on the ethical implications of that type of research. And that's where I
Wow.
was involved. I was involved in the middle of it, trying to decide, okay, we need that type of research to advance our understanding. And, but at the same time, we need to improve the patient care in Canada, because if there are a lot of coma patients who are actually cognitively intact, then we need to treat them as such, right? So then,
Right.
yeah, right? They then the question becomes, okay, then should they have assent when making medical decisions? There's questions like that. You know, how involved should they be in their own medical care if they're cognitively? So these hard questions, that's what I set out to answer. And then in the end, a paper came out of it where we suggested to our government some policy suggestions on how healthcare policies need to change, you know, how we can improve the landscape of healthcare for these patients with severe brain trauma.
That's fascinating. And so, yeah, I think so. You did some work on the ethics part of and it's so crazy because now, with the Internet of Things and being able to connect the EEGs to patients' thoughts, and, people can move robotic arms, or, I mean, that's going to be they could even write the consent in theory, And so, what sort of um, insights for this policy did you kind of come to, in essence from this paper? What sort of insights for these patients?
Right. So the insights came from the science of it, right? From my colleagues who were really close to the science in doing that type of ethically based research on these patients, right? And their family members gave the consent, and there was the ethics board involved, so it was ethical conduct. But the thing is, now there's this finding, we can't unsee it, we can't unlearn that, right?
Right.
So what we ended up doing was developing a framework on how we need to structure and start to think about these hard questions, like how involved in their medical care, end of life decisions, involvement for proxies, you know, like decision care givers from the family, or someone who was designated as a proxy decision maker. So basically, we came up with a framework on how we could move forward with refining the healthcare in Canada.
Oh, that's great. That's awesome. Almost like a little more in-depth algorithm as to guidance to take for the practitioners. That's awesome. And then so from that, then what was your next big uh, kind of wish to accomplish, or what was your next goal after that?
So when during that, in the middle of that project, I had to wrap things up, and we were leading this I was leading this workshop, and that's where all the biggest thought leaders, all the biggest scientists and neurologists came together in one room, and we had this mastermind of people talking about, okay, what's the next step, right? And then after that came over, that's when we wrote the paper, we published the paper, and we did our policy recommendation. And then that's when I decided to leave academia.
Mm.
Yeah, I left academia, and that's where I started when I went into the corporate world. Yeah, it was there. I left the academia, and that was my first foray into business in that company.
And that's such a big, it sounds like, so we're just kind of talking about it right here, and but it's such a big uh transition to make. And so what was kind of sort of the what was sort of the points that you said, that's it, I have to go change something? What was some of those insights?
You mean like how I decided to leave academia?
Right, yeah.
Okay, okay. It wasn't that I didn't feel like I was making contributions. I was making contributions. They were meaningful contributions to me. It was just this, how you have an inner voice that's
Hmm.
calling you. So I'm very astute. I'm very keen on listening to my inner voice, and something about being in the academic culture it wasn't quite what I pictured myself doing long term, right? So if your listeners are familiar, the academic culture is very specific. It's very unique.
Hmm.
It takes a certain person to thrive in it, to succeed in it, right? And while I did, I what I didn't find that matched with my values was how strong the emphasis was on publications as the measurement and the currency for success,
Right.
right? So it's the biggest currency is that you must publish often in medical journals and in specific medical journals, and then you earn points depending on how the impact factor, that's what they call it, the impact factor of the journal you publish in. So that type of a currency for success didn't match with my values. I wanted to have more of an impact, and I was also exploring business. And so that's how I decided to leave academia, because a lot of publications and a lot of the process of matching and giving that type of a currency, it wasn't inspiring to me. Yeah, it
Hmm.
just wasn't, and I had to be honest with myself on it. So I left academia, and that's how I decided to go into. I was given a business role in a corporate company, and I accepted it.
Wow. And how was that transition? And then what sort of business were you in, and the industry, and the specifics of what type of entailed your work at
Yeah,
that
so
time?
it was okay. I was given two separate, very different offers, and in the end, I chose this one, which was in the biotechnology sector. And my role was in business strategy, so it was very all of a sudden it was a complete 180 from my background. I had no training. I didn't do an MBA. I never did any courses on economics or commerce or no business training. And here I was launched into this role where I had to manage a product line that brought in $4 million a year. And I had to grow this business. I had to grow this product line. I had to, so it was in part marketing, there was business strategy, there was product management, there was competitive intelligence, there was market research, market intelligence, and all of that was very pragmatic, right? And so my performance was measured in how well I increased the company's bottom line. Yeah, in the end, I grew that product line by 40%.
Oh, that's awesome.
It was
That's
just Yeah, it was year on year. That was my KPI, my key performance indicator was that metric of how much revenue am I bringing in compared to last quarter or last year or something, whatever the framework is. So it was very much a business role, and there was no training. I had to assume the identity of, yes, I am a businesswoman. I am a product manager. I am the market intelligence here. And I assumed the identity, I committed to it, and I learned on the job. I did whatever it took to be proficient on the job, to build the team, to meet my KPIs and exceed them.
That's awesome. You know, you mentioned something so important, the identity shift that has to happen. And I think in medicine, I see this a lot with the patients that have chronic conditions because people become, I am a diabetic, I am a cholesterol, I am obese, I am alcoholic, I am. And so then this becomes their identity, and it takes a complete shift to be able for them to assume a completely different personality. Huh?
It's so true. And you know what, Andres, a lot of my clients, they come to me and they say, it's so easily said. It's more easily said than done. I know I have to do it. Intellectually, I know I got to make an identity shift, but it's insurmountable. I don't know how to do that. And it seems like it's an impossible feat. But the thing is, I argue that it's actually not. The starting point of it is as simple as deciding what you want to have for dinner. You decide what you want to have for dinner. You decide what you want to drink with your dinner. It's a decision. And the same thing, it starts with a decision, the exact same decision you make. Your brain is making your decision the same way. I decide I'm going to have this for dinner. I decide this is my identity. So when you decide, decidere, that is the root word, the root origin of the word decide, which means you cut off everything else, right? So when you decide that, you are disowning everything that you owned before in that old identity. You disown it. So it's unbecoming that, and then you decide to become that. So unbecoming first, and then you become. And it's a process, but the start of it is as simple as a decision.
You nailed it. I think you're so right. And I learned recently that the word identity is being repeatedly. It means being repeatedly, and yeah, it's like the decision has taken place, and then is the brain. I mean, from the studies also shows that our brain then starts tracking whatever is out in the world to be able to support that decision. And from the neurological standpoint, from the neuroscience standpoint, how do you see that, or what type of neuroscience insights kind of have you gained that? Yes, you know, once you take a decision, the brain starts picking up relevant factors to support that.
Yeah. Yeah. But the thing is, we have biases too. Our brain has biases. So we are conditioned to believe a certain thing. We've conditioned ourselves to believe in our old identity. So now it's about deciding, no, I'm not going to believe that anymore. And if you look for evidence, our brains are evidence searching machines. So look for evidence against the contrary. Dare to prove yourself wrong. when and when you do, when you look for it, you'll find it. You'll look for that which you find. And you can begin the process of unbecoming the old thing and becoming the more productive and constructive identity that you need to become. And once you become, then automatically you'll be able to do things you never did before, right? Because you have to become the person before you can do the things that you need to do. And when you start to become, when you become, then you start to do, because now you're able to with that new identity. It builds your confidence because now you are able to rest in the truth of what you've accomplished. And the truth of what you've accomplished is what gives you confidence. But seeing is not believing. You don't have to wait until you have accomplishments in order to believe that you can do it. Our brains cannot tell the difference between what's real and what's imaginary. So if you just simply visualize it, If you just simply go back to your childhood curiosity years and you start to imagine things, give yourself permission to be creative in your imaginations, bold in your imagination, your brain can't tell the difference between real and imaginary. And it'll start seeing that as a truth, right? And that is very important in the decision process too, is to imagine, to visualize. Some people say meditate and visualize. It doesn't matter what you do. It's not the activity that's important. It's the intent, and and the reason why you're doing that.
That is so cool. And what was one of the? I mean, you said it so well, and that's awesome. As you're saying it, I'm having so many insights and everything. And when you were going through that, what was your hardest obstacle in that shifted identity? What was the hardest thing that you went through as you're becoming from a scientist now to a businesswoman? What was the hardest? That was the hardest thing. What was the first obstacle?
The first or the hardest? Those two are
The
different.
hardest. The hardest.
Okay, because my first obstacle is very different from my hardest obstacle. Right. My hardest obstacle was overcoming the fear of taking risks and failing. Right. I had a huge fear around failing because this is a huge risk. Right. I'm not going to lie. Doing reinventing yourself and reinventing your career, which is what I did, is a huge risk and it's a huge undertaking. Right. So with every risk, if you fail, then I had so much fear around wasting time because I failed it. And it's like, oh my gosh, I spent so much time and energy and effort into it. If I failed, I wasted all that time trying. And then I'm taking a step back in my career. And all of those fears were just around failing. And that was my hardest obstacle.
Wow. And how did you then chop away? How did you start taking on that obstacle? Did you notice that that was the first obstacle? And how did you become aware of that? And then how did you kind of overcome that?
Remember, it wasn't my first obstacle. It was
Your
my hard,
hardest, yeah.
yeah. My first obstacle was completely different. It's different.
Well, how
Okay,
well that's how what was your first obstacle? We can knock that one out. How what
sure.
was your first obstacle?
My first obstacle was around what other people would think. Because here I was in academia. I did a PhD, I did a postdoc, and now I'm about to leave everything behind. I'm leaving academia. Whereas you've been in that system for a while, like I have, my whole thing. I've been 10 years in college. The expectation, it's an unwritten expectation. The expectation is that I'm going to go all the way, become a tenured professor. That's the definition of success, the epitome of success. I become a tenured professor. So that's the expectation. Why else would you do a PhD if you don't want to stay in academia? Right? That's the culture in academia. So here I was handing my resignation and leaving. My first challenge was, oh my gosh, how am I going to answer people who are going to criticize me? Right? I was afraid about what people would think of me.
Hmm.
Are they going to think that I'm a loser because I didn't want to stay in academia? Are they going to think I didn't make it? I failed, so I'm quitting. I was so afraid about what people would think. And I received the criticisms. Of course I did. Yeah, there was half the people would tell me, "How could you quit? You've come this far. How could you leave now? You've come this far. You know, you spend 5 years in your PhD and now you're leaving. Wasn't that a waste of time?" Like criticism like that. So I
Yeah.
got the criticism. That was my first challenge.
And how was that for you? How did you take that on? How um, I can definitely relate, in the criticism and how did you take that on and how did you overcome it?
Well, it wasn't about overcoming it because the thing is, I did the preparation work inside of me first. So internally, everything in life is always more of an inner game than an outer game. So when I was preparing, when I first started to have an inkling that I didn't see myself in the academic world, I knew one day I would leave. So I started preparing myself for that journey already. And this meant also managing my emotions around it and seeing for myself what's true and what's not true. So I got peace for myself that I didn't waste my PhD. This is not a sunken cost fallacy, right? And this, so then therefore, no matter what people said to me, no matter how they criticized me or whatever they thought, I was certain and I was confident in myself and my decision because I had already been at peace with it. See, so then I win the battle before it's even fought.
Yeah,
Yeah, so that's
that mental rehearsal, right? That like putting yourself in that situation, then when you get there your brain is like, oh, this is the second time we've been here.
yeah.
Yes,
So
definitely.
that's how I handled that one.
Oh, that's awesome. And then then the hardest obstacle of, fearing failure, fear and failure, how was that and how did you take that on?
Right. It was really getting down to what is failure exactly and what is it not, right? And what I came to the conclusion and realizing is that failure is just part of the feature. It's a feature of the journey. It's not it's not the end of the journey. It's not a turning point of the journey. It's not a signal to quit. Nothing like that. It's just a built-in feature of it. And so what failure does, because it's a feature, it actually has a function. All features have a function, they have a benefit, right? So when you see it that way, it helps you to be attuned to failure as feedback. When you fail at something, you learn right there what you need to do differently, what was working, what was not working, right? It also helps you in your personal development, which is so important. It helps you keeping your humility in check. It helps you share with others the mistakes you've made so they don't have to make the same mistake. It helps you with having greater impact. It helps you having case studies, having a story you can tell. All of these things are part and parcel of features of failure. And when you see it that way, it's unstoppable. When you see it that way, it's no longer paralyzing. It is you see that everything has a dualistic nature of it. Nothing can be 100% negative or 100% positive. Right. And so the thing is, when you see it that way, all of a sudden I became more inspired actually to come across as many failures as I could so that I could get to the success that I wanted. And
Definitely.
therefore, yeah, and therefore, I no longer fear it.
That's awesome. And the more you fail, the more features, the more knowledge, the more insights. And of course it's easier said than done in our culture sometimes because we fear, failure so much. But definitely such an important part of our growth. I mean, every time we get knocked down, it's like there is so much growth there. You know, and And then from that point, what was what was started to happen in your corporate? Of course, you achieved a lot of success in your corporate career, and then what happened there that you decided, I need to change my identity again, or I need to reinvent my career or start my own business? How was that transition for you?
Yeah. So that last part was less of a transition. It was more of an answer to my calling, right? So uh, in my current business, what I do is I help professionals, right? I teach them how to unlock true vocational confidence, where they can reinvent themselves again and again in their career, no matter what the economy is, no matter what job opportunity is out there, no matter what's happening in the external that they don't have control of. I show them how they can unlock true vocational confidence and build fulfilling careers and expand that into creating an inspired life. Right. So that's what I do in my business. And I had been doing this work during my PhD. You see, what happened was during my PhD, I was already starting to coach people, mentor people. I was running workshops and seminars around career navigating, the career path, how to think about career path. I was already doing that. It just wasn't my business. It was something that I was passionate about because I realized that in the education system, they don't teach you how to do that. It's a serious limitation in the PhD program, master's program, any program in college and high school, the school system. It just doesn't teach you how to answer the more important questions in life. And I found that this limitation is leaving a lot of students feeling burned by spending years in college and then not knowing what to do with it, or how to use their degree, or how to make more money, or how to plan their life. You know what I mean? And then so they have this degree and then it's like, okay, now what? And then they choose a path and it ends up doesn't make sense later on, you know. So I wanted to close that gap. So during my PhD, I was running workshops and seminars and I was educating and I was teaching already. So fast forward after my PhD, after my postdoc, after my corporate experience, that's when I decided to go all in and to put it out there in the world, my message that you can create the life that you want, and that's going to be fueled by the career that you build, right? And this was my message, and my movement is career revisionist, right? Being a
I
career
love that.
revisionist, yes. And that was the whole thing was behind, this is the movement, the global movement that I'm putting out there. And so when I left the corporate world, it was an answer to my calling, that this is what I have to do. I must do it. You know, this is the purpose of my life, the meaningful purpose of my life.
Wow, that's awesome. Because in right now in the world, we have such a there's such a transition happening right now from a world in which people used to work in factories for 30, 40 years, and there is so much guilt associated with living these type of careers, and nowadays, of course, we've become more flexible, and people are leaving more jobs, but they're lost inside in terms of like their own compass. I love what you said, like you're giving them permission to reinvent themselves continuously.
Mhm.
and
That's right.
and go ahead.
Oh, I was saying not just permission, but a proven strategy on how to do it. Yeah.
That's great. And then when you started that answering to that calling that you had, what was the first block road that you went through uh, when you left corporate into now the world that you're now a business owner?
That's right. I ran into all the challenges that a startup would face. You know, I was a startup, right? Here you go. So you incorporate your business, you have a domain name, you do all that stuff that entrepreneurs do. And of course, all of that is secondary, right? But I had my vision, I had my strategy, my market strategy, I had the impact. I had that vision in mind. So of course, the challenges I face are challenges that any entrepreneur would face. How do you get your message out there? How do you reach a lot of people? How do you have a global impact? How do I communicate effectively? How do I inspire people? How do I communicate effectively? All of these things, all of these are challenges that any entrepreneur would face in the beginning stages of a new company, and I was no different. I had to think about, how do I grow and scale? How do I build my team? And then when I onboard new team members, how do I make sure they're inspired? How do I make sure that I can provide for them? How can I make sure that I can consistently be a good business owner? To be ethical, to provide my best programs, my best teaching. How do I make sure that I can deliver that in a way that changes people's lives? These are all challenges that I face.
Wow, yeah, there's a lot, right? At
Yeah.
one any of these points, did you ever feel like, I don't know about this? That you were at that point that like doubts and starts creeping in, or you thought maybe this is not possible, or was there at any point or even or close to that or anything like that happened to you?
So I never doubted that that was my calling. I never doubted my ability that I could help someone like that. I
Mm,
never doubted my programs. I never doubted that I had the the skills and the knowledge to coach someone through that process. No, so I didn't face that. But what I did doubt was my my abilities as an entrepreneur to navigate and choose the correct market strategy. Right? This is a very strategic side of it, right? Because there's one
Hmm.
side of me that I'm a coach, so that's the delivery side. I have to deliver the product to the clients. That side of me, no problem. No problem. I can deliver, I can teach, I can coach, no problem. But
Right.
this other side, the strategy part of me, that's new to me. So now I have what's called an influencer business. I have a coaching business. It's an online coaching business. It's global, right? So there's a lot of strategy that needs to come into place. I need to wear different hats. I need to think about budget. I need to think about marketing. I need to think about sales. I need to think about outreach. So that's what I mean. That's all business development, right? So that was that other side of me that I knew I needed to further develop.
That's so true. And becoming that new person. And what's that story that comes up to you in one of your clients or one of the people that you've helped along all these years that you were so proud of? That you were like, oh, I love this. Like, is that something like that come to mind?
Oh yeah, there's so many. There's so many.
Awesome.
But I guess a recent one was there was a gentleman that I worked with who had been a sales manager for many, many years. And this was close to 20 years in the same company for 20 years. And he was in corporate. So we had a similar background. He was in corporate, sales manager. So we were in a different role, but he was in corporate. And what happened was inside of his company, they started restructuring, and he had no choice. He had no say in the matter. They restructured the company and they took away some of his sales territories. So then he started to earn less money, and it was concerning to him because he was at this point where he and his wife wanted to save for retirement. They have one daughter who's about to go to college now, and they wanted to provide for her. And there was just a lot of anxiety around, well, how do I provide? I'm the breadwinner of the family, but I'm not inspired by what I do. Should I quit? Should I look for another job? But then I don't want to start from junior position. So I came in, he came to me, we worked together, and we worked together. I taught him some of the principles that I teach all my other clients, and I coached him through the process. In the end, he ended up staying with the company, but I helped him to work through a better positioning. And he became a sales leader, from sales manager to sales leader, and he more than doubled his income.
Hmm.
And so I love that story, not just because he ended up making more money than he ever thought imaginable, but the side effect, the byproduct of that was that his daughter started to see the changes in his life. And as a result, she started to confide in him on her own career. And
Wow.
it was like a new fledged relationship they never had before. And he shares with me how he loves being the light in her daughter's life, and the role model in his daughter's life. And it's just a gift to him. And that was really what sealed it in for me. What makes me tear up every time I hear that story is that unexpected side result that came out of it. So
Yeah,
I
this
thought,
on it. Uh
yeah,
huh.
that's why I believe that you can't separate your career and life. What happens in one affects the other.
Yeah, these beautiful unintended consequences that when we improve in one area of our lives, not only impact us, but our families, our loved ones, the people that we work with. And so that's such a great story to how the career, and that you don't have to go be a singer, like within his own framework, right? That's okay if you do, but like within his own framework to improve and upgrade himself to the next version that he wanted to be. And then that impacted the way that his daughter looked at him forever, in the relationship together. And so improving his well being. That's great, Dr. Lee. And so what's next for you?
What's next for me is just to growing out this movement. I mean, for me, this is more than just a business, right? This
Mhm.
movement that I want to create, my ultimately, if I could help 1 million, if I can impact 1 million individuals to empower them to have and achieve true vocational confidence, that is ultimately my vision and my dream, is to have that impact and to inspire 1 million dream careers and inspired lives being created intentionally and with purpose.
That is awesome. I love that, and it's such a relevant time for that right now. And
Mhm.
like, you're the perfect person to be doing this, you know. So I'm so happy to know that you came into the show to share with us all your amazing stories. And then, if people want to hear about you or learn from you, what is a good place that they can find you?
Yeah, that's great. I'm on LinkedIn, so if you follow me on LinkedIn, my handle is Doc Grace Lee. So that the URL is Doc Grace Lee, or you can search Dr. Grace Lee Vancouver. I'll come up on LinkedIn. My website is also named after the movement. So the movement is Career Revisionist. So the website is just careerrevisionist.com, and there's like two R's in the middle. So careerrevisionist.com, and there you can link to my channels as well, my show, my podcast, and my other social channels.
That is awesome, Dr. Lee. Well, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate all your insights and all the best in your movement.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be on your show. Thank you.
All right. Take care.